Welcome to Speak Your Mind by Climobilize. My guest for this session is Max Wilbert. Max is a writer and biocentric community organizer, the co-founder of Protect Thacker Pass, and co-author of the book Bright Green Lies: How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way and What We Can Do About It. Max, it's great to have you with us today.
Glad to be here, Brad.
I'm excited to have people meet you because I think you're awesome. And let's get started. In this session, Max will be speaking about why has declaring climate emergencies mostly failed to create meaningful change. So why don't we start there, Max, and jump right in? Why aren't declaring climate emergencies having a meaningful impact?
Well, first I want to say, Brad, that it's very clear to me that we're in a climate crisis. It's an apocalyptic situation. I was just writing a week or two ago about my travel to Siberia with climate scientists back in 2010, studying the permafrost thaw and the warming that is hitting the Arctic about 4 times faster than the rest of the world. So this issue is so incredibly important, and the projections, which are constantly being surpassed by the reality, are very dire, as everyone who's watching this knows. With that all said, I look at the climate crisis as a symptom of a much broader problem, of the ecological crisis itself, of this broken relationship that we have with the natural world in this dominant culture that we live in. We live within an economy that is destroying the planet in many different ways. Carbon is not the least of those, and greenhouse gas emissions and the global warming that it creates is such a serious issue. But many people don't look at it as part of this broader polycrisis, as it's sometimes called, in which all these different issues are converging and causing something, creating something that is larger than their parts. It's synergy in the negative sense. Um, so there are the reason why the climate emergencies are not working, in my opinion, is that the economy that we live in is functionally unsustainable. What I mean by that is that the unsustainability, the greenhouse gas emissions, and all the other impacts on habitat destruction and so on, they're not they're not minor externalities that can be easily solved. They're not problems that can be simply addressed by, for example, swapping out what's under the hood of our cars or changing the sources of energy that power the economy and the electric grid and so on. And there are concrete technical and financial and social reasons that that is the case. Uh, just to give one example, I live in Oregon in the Pacific Northwest, where I grew up, and I've lived in this region my whole life. Most of the electricity in this region comes from hydropower. It's wintertime right now, and it's cloudy all the time, and solar panels here on the west side of the mountains just don't produce energy during this time of year, barely anything. Um, the grid that we have right now with the hydroelectric power, the natural gas, and so on, that was built up over the course of more than 100 years. And replacing that, changing that to support an entirely new energy system is very challenging. Um, on top of this, it's very important for people to understand that currently electricity is only about 20% of the energy that we use in this culture. So most energy is used in the form of gas and diesel being burned in car engines. It's used in the form of coal being burned in furnaces to smelt steel and aluminum and so on. So it's being used as direct fuels, not in the form of electricity. And it's important that we understand this because there are technical reasons that make it very, very, very challenging to transition the economy as it currently exists from being powered by largely fossil fuels to one powered largely by lower carbon sources of energy. And it's important that we understand this because if it is extremely difficult, possibly even functionally impossible, given the economy we have right now, to make that transition happen, then that's not the path to solving global warming. Like that premise, that we can simply swap out the power sources, the energy sources, and the technologies that are running our society more or less as it currently exists, that premise is wrong, in my opinion. And that is why, Brad, I think that these climate emergencies have been failing. We've seen this in places like Germany, which have poured trillions of dollars into green energy technologies and energy transitions and so on. They're still a major burner of coal. They still export a lot of coal, and they're still engaging in a lot of earth-destroying activities. More importantly, in part, they're still embedded in this global economy, in which when you do have emissions reductions in one country, they're often being offset by emissions increases in another country. And those places are linked by global trade, right? We're all interconnected in this system of corporate globalization that we live in right now. And this, I don't say this to be a downer, but to be a realist, to understand what is actually happening on the ground around the world, which is that energy use is rising, renewables are rising, but fossil fuels are rising too. More oil and coal are being burned, more natural gas is being burned, and emissions are continuing to rise. So I believe that we need to take a different path. We need to change the game fundamentally and not operate under this premise that this way of life, this industrial modernity that we are so used to, is the path to a sustainable future.
So that is a message that is hard to swallow. People need to reevaluate how they live, how they commute, how they work, what they do for social engagements, leisure. We're not asking people to buy a electric vehicle anymore. Um, uh, Living your values is not about switching how you get around. And I was fortunate enough to find time to read your book, Break Green Lies, and it's brilliant. And it tells us about the real story behind this environmental movement that has lost its way. But what is the pathway to a mobilization of a global population that doesn't really want to hear bad news? Because it's not fun news that you're sharing. It has to be altered for consumption. How do we tell that story?
It's challenging, Brad, and I think that the reality is many people say we're not facing a problem because problems have solutions. We're facing a predicament. It's a predicament that's been created by hundreds, maybe thousands of years of the development of our society up to this point, leading to a point where there are more than 8 billion people on the planet. We're all eating food that's produced and brought to us with fossil fuels. We're transporting ourselves, or even if we're staying at home, things are coming to us on fossil fuel powered vehicles. The economy itself just exists in this state of rapid energy and material consumption. And we're in what ecologists call a state of overshoot. We're consuming more resources than the planet can sustainably produce on an ongoing basis. And that means that we're undermining the ecological foundations of our own future. That's what's happening right now. That's what a sustainability crisis is. That's what that means. And so the future is either we change our ways or we run up against the brick wall. And a lot of people don't want to face that reality. It's uncomfortable, it's challenging, but we have to be the adults in the room. We are the adults in the room because we're not seeing leadership on these issues in a meaningful way from almost any government around the world. There may be one or two exceptions on very small scales. But these issues are not being taken seriously in the corporate world. And even in the nonprofit world, we see so much focus on technology as the savior. I think that's largely as a result of foundation funding because the whole idea behind technology as what's going to save us, it's very appealing, right? It's you can have your cake and eat it too. It's this idea that we can keep living more or less the same way we live now, and we're just going to let the tech companies solve the problem. And that's unfortunately not what's playing out in reality. At places like Thacker Pass, where I was deeply involved in fighting a lithium mine, you have this mineral that's being mined there right now because we lost that fight for electric cars, and it's destroying habitat. That mine is releasing large amounts of carbon emissions. And of course, EVs have lower emissions than internal combustion engine cars. But the point is, they're still incredibly destructive to the planet. It's a slower form of destruction of the planet, but it's still destruction ongoing. And this this distracts us from doing what is actually important. And I believe we must begin with shifting our allegiance from the dominant culture that we live in to the planet itself, to the living world, which provides every breath of air, every drink of water, every bite of food that we eat. It all comes from the planet ultimately. And our children, our grandchildren, and future generations are not going to judge us on whether we were individually wonderful people in terms of taking the right consumer actions and so on. They're going to judge us on, did we put the world on a path to sustainability or not? And I think that when you're living in one of the wealthy nations of the world, like Canada or the United States, it's easy to think to yourself, things are normal, things are continuing more or less the same that they are. But this truly is a crisis. And those of us who live in the West are protected from it by, frankly, large militaries and huge amounts of energy expenditure. If you're living in Bangladesh or the small island nations or in Pakistan or many other places around the world, this crisis is on your front door right now. It's not a game. And so when we talk about challenging the culture of consumption, challenging this industrial modernity that we live in, there was a book called Hospicing Modernity that I thought was a very interesting term to talk about these issues, written by a woman, I believe from Brazil, who's part indigenous, who basically said that this modern way of life that we've been living for the last 30, 40, 50, 70 years since the end of World War II in the West, it's been self-evident to many people around the world that it's not sustainable for that entire time. It's not going to last. And the question is, how are we deliberately going to transition out of this way of life to a much more localized, low energy, low consumption form of life? And that's a way that people have lived around the planet for thousands of years.
And we can be comfortable knowing that nobody is talking about this issue, and we are going to walk blindly towards it. One thing that strikes me as interesting is the concept that a lot of people have of living their values. And there's so many people who say, I'm living my values. We bought ourselves a Tesla, and we put solar panels on our roof, and we insulated our home, and we're living our values, and we recycle. And if you put that person next to you and you compared someone living their values, I mean, that is a misrepresentation of what it means to do something that is positive for the planet. It's misleading. It's a, I don't want to use the word, but it's a lie to yourself to make you feel better. And we all want to feel better about ourselves. And not that many people are going to go and do what you did. And maybe you can just touch upon it for a little bit about what exactly went on at Thacker Pass and how it shaped your perspective by seeing what a mine really is.
Sure, Brad. Well, first of all, I'll just say that I think personal action is important in the sense that it's a step on the journey of self-education, learning about the issues, building your emotional connection to what's happening and starting to take those initial steps. But we've been trained to act as consumers rather than as human beings, as political animals, as creatures with actual power to influence the course of events. If you're thinking as a consumer, you're thinking very, very small, and you're exactly where the corporations want you to be. Um, I got started as an activist at a pretty young age, and when I heard about this Thacker Pass lithium mine issue, I visited the place. I have a background in camping and backpacking and outdoor activities of all sorts, and spend a lot of time in wild places. And I fell in love with that land there, simply put. And I think that that direct relationship to the land is so important when it comes to the future of the environmental movement, and real sustainability is about direct relationship to land. And we decided, me and a few friends decided, we've got to fight to protect this place. We got to defend it. And so almost exactly 3 years ago in January 2021, we set up a protest camp on the site of this proposed open pit mine. We were late in the process because the whole thing was fast tracked under the Trump administration, all the normal environmental review process, which it's not very good. It's not sufficient to protect the planet. But even that insufficient process was rushed and was truncated, excuse me, under the Trump administration. So we got out there as soon as we could on the ground, set up this protest camp. We were there for about a year on the ground. We brought thousands of people out to the site. We found out from local Native people who became friends and allies that it was an incredibly sacred place. We learned more about the biodiversity and had all these incredible experiences with the wildlife in this area, the old growth sagebrush, this incredible ecosystem that's so underappreciated. Um, and then we ran up against the power of the state and the corporation. My friend and I, Will Falk, we've been fined about $50,000 by the federal government for building an outhouse for Native elders to use while engaging in ceremony on this sacred site. Um, I'm facing a lawsuit along with 6 other people for taking nonviolent direct action to defend the land. And one young Native woman was arrested, protesting and working to protect the site. And right now, the land is being destroyed. So we are very grateful for what we did out there. I think we began to shift the conversation globally on these issues. In the grassroots environmental movement around the world, you're now seeing more attention being paid to the harms related to mining for green technologies. And this certainly isn't the only case. You have lithium mines in Serbia, which have faced massive protests. In Portugal, you have nickel being mined in Indonesia right now, going into electric vehicle batteries specifically. That's destroying the jungle habitat of an uncontacted indigenous tribe, the Hangana Manyawa tribe. An organization called Survival International has really been working to advocate for their protection. Um, so these issues are playing out all over the world. That's just a few examples out of literally hundreds. And this is a new frontier in the same extractive economy that has been destroying the planet for hundreds of years now. And that's why I think it is so important that we all, again, build that direct connection and relationship to land, fall in love with it, and shift our allegiance so that our allegiance is not to electric vehicles or to a car culture that, quote unquote, needs them. Our allegiance is to the land. I don't know where the balloons came from. It's to the land, it's to the sagebrush, it's to the mule deer, the pronghorn antelope, the cougars, the wild birds, the sage grouse, the sage sparrows, the rattlesnakes, all the wildlife that lives in these wild places, and the water, the air, the mountains, the rivers that originate in them.
Yeah. I don't think capitalism looks at sage-grouse the same way you do, unfortunately. So we're coming to the end here, and you've given us a lot to digest. And I guess the question is, big question, where do we go from here? And what do we need to do differently? And what actions can we take to compel corporations and politicians to perhaps do something that they're supposed to do instead of what their donors tell them to do?
It's a really good question, Brad, and something that you can spend your life dedicated to. And we should be doing that. I think this is the generational task of our time. I have outlined 6 points often in my talks that I say is our generational task. Number one, we need to challenge false solutions and greenwashing because that's a distraction. And if we don't get those out of the way and expose the truth on these issues, then they will continue to divert people, energy, resources, politicians, entire nations away from the real solutions that we need to be looking at. Number two is I think we need emergency degrowth programs to rapidly reduce consumption and scale down society, power down our society while preserving human rights and relocalizing. Number three is part of that, but I make this separate because I think it's so important. We need to relocalize sustainable food systems and other necessities, the basics, right? These can't be produced 3,000 miles away. That is simply not sustainable no matter what is powering it. We need to relocalize on an emergency level. Number four, we need to address overpopulation in humane ways. That mainly means educating and empowering women and girls. People like to say, as soon as you mention overpopulation, that you're terrible for all these different reasons. There are people working on overpopulation issues all around the world in every nation. And as one prominent researcher on these issues have said, the most overpopulated countries are the wealthiest in the world because that's where population gets multiplied massively, the impacts by the massive overconsumption that we have in these wealthy countries. Number five, we need to stop destructive projects and industries. We need to stop them. We need to stop the destruction of the land. That means stopping pipelines, oil drilling, fracking, tar sands, logging, mining, industrial agriculture, all of these things. They need to be shut down. That's going to take political organizing on a scale that we have not seen. We just simply have not seen that. And yet we need to mobilize to make this happen. That in itself is a huge project in which books can and have been written, and I can recommend many. And number six, we need to support the land in healing. In most cases, the earth can heal without our help, and has been doing so for eons from volcanic eruptions and landslides and everything else. But in some cases, we can help that process along and actually participate in the ecology of our regions, and participate in making things, excuse me, in making things better simply by our lives and the way that we move, the way that we act, the things we eat, and so on. That's a process that we can engage in a positive way on this planet. But if we don't do those other things, if we don't stop the greenwashing, do emergency degrowth programs, relocalize our food systems, address overpopulation in positive ways, and stop the destruction of the planet, then we're not going to get to that sixth step of healing the land.
That's perfect. You know what? In a world that truly cared about environmental issues, those 6 points, or whatever you wanted to say in 1 minute, would be how you turn on your cell phone. You do your password, and then Max has 1 minute every single time to tell you exactly those points because we're not getting that message. And it's it's difficult medicine, but we put ourselves in this position. We ignored it for a long time. The cancer has expanded, and we have to take tough medicine. Um, Max, you're great. I've told you that many times. And we're lucky to have people like you fighting for the planet. And I look forward to fighting these challenges with you in 2024, and best of luck, and be well and keep up the good fight.
Thank you so much, Brad. It's a real honor to be here.
Thank you.